Good morning, everybody. Here we are, bright and early. Say hi, hashtag. We're excited to finish chapter 3 with you today. Now, do you remember the beginning of chapter 3 yesterday? Much Afraid thought they were going in the wrong direction, but the shepherd said that sometimes you have to go to, not sometimes, the shepherd said you have to go to the valley. It's part of the path to get to the high places. Remember, she built an altar and she got a stone and the shepherd gave her a bag. And then she found a flower that was called Acceptance with Joy. And we talked about when bad things happen or hard things happen, having a good attitude and not a bad one. So now we are going to finish chapter 3. So here's how it starts. Much Afraid and the shepherd, together with Suffering and Sorrow, kept walking through the desert. Then one day, quite suddenly, they came to a path. "This," said the shepherd quietly, "is the way you are to go." So they turned and after a while found themselves on the shore of a great sea. "It's time for me to leave you, Much Afraid," he said, "and return to the mountains. Even though you seem farther away than ever from the high places, I will still come to you quickly if you call me." He then went leaping and bounding across the desert toward the mountains, which were far behind them. Much Afraid and her 2 helpers walked along the shores of the great sea for many days. She began to know the name of the place where she presently journeyed. It was called Loneliness. Now the mountains were out of sight and her home in the valley was far, far away. There seemed to be nothing in the whole world except for the desert on one side and the endless, dreary sea on the other. Often an icy wind would blow and the only sound was the lonely crying of seagulls overhead. In those days, Much Afraid never let go of the hands of her 2 helpers. It was amazing how swiftly they helped her along. It was also amazing how she walked now with hardly a limp. Somehow, something had happened to her in the desert. She was learning to accept with joy the path the shepherd had for her. Although she went with sorrow and suffering day after day beside the sea of loneliness, Much Afraid felt a happiness in her heart. She even began to realize that the place was strangely beautiful. She spoke words to herself that she had read in the great book. "When he has tried me, I shall come forth as gold. Weeping may last for a night, but joy comes in the morning." Meanwhile, far away in the valley, her fearing relatives had been waiting for Pride to come back with Much Afraid. I forgot about her fearing relatives, did you? As time passed, they realized he must not have been able to make her turn around and was now too proud to come back and admit that he had failed. They decided they had to send others to help him before Much Afraid reached the high places and was forever out of their reach. Spies were sent out to find Pride, and they brought back word that Much Afraid was nowhere near the mountains, but far away on the shores of Lake Loneliness. This made her relatives very excited. They quickly agreed on who should go and help Pride bring Much Afraid back to them. Resentment, bitterness, and self-pity left right away. Now they are a hot mess of a trio. Look at them. Have you ever met those 3? Resentment is like anger. He's even as strong as hatred. If he ever tries to speak to you, don't listen. His cousin Bitterness is a sarcastic, sour fellow. In fact, if you listen to him too much, his words act like poison. He holds grudges and he never forgives. Self-pity is someone who seems to be around everyone at some time. He tries to get you to feel sorry for yourself. If you ever think things like "poor me" or "nobody likes me" or "why does it always have to happen to me," watch out, because that is self-pity talking to you. You need to start thinking about Jesus and other people and quit worrying about yourself. So those were the three characters who joined Pride. Off they went to the shores of loneliness. However, her enemies soon discovered that this was not the same Much Afraid they used to know. They could not get close to her because she kept so near to sorrow and suffering. All they could do was call out to her. So, I want you to look at their faces again while you listen to what they called out. "I told you so," Pride shouted. "Where are you now, you little fool? Up on the high places? Ha! He's gone and left you, just like I said he would." Resentment raised his ugly head over a rock. "Who is this shepherd that you follow? Why do you let him treat you like this? He promised to take you to the high places, and here you are, next to the desert." Then bitterness sneered out from behind another rock. "The more you let him, the more he will keep doing cruel things to you. You had better turn around and leave him now, before he asks even more of you." Self-pity was almost worse than the others. Look at him. He spoke so softly and in such a whimpering voice that Much Afraid felt weak all over. "Poor little Much Afraid," he whispered. "You have every right to feel sorry for yourself. You have been so willing and so obedient. But he keeps thinking up some new way to hurt you and cause such pain." This last remark was a mistake. The word pain suddenly reminded Much Afraid of the lessons she learned while she was inside the pyramid. The threshing floor, the potter's wheel, the fiery furnace, all would cause pain, but it was necessary if she wanted to be changed into what the shepherd wanted her to be. When she thought of this, to self-pity's shock, she picked up a piece of rock and threw it at him with all her might. Now, we don't necessarily say that throwing rocks is a good thing, but when it's against self-pity, it's allowed. She became more and more tired of listening to the voices of her enemies. She couldn't hold her ears because sorrow and suffering were holding her hands. It was getting harder to resist their whining, and she was getting weaker. Finally, Much Afraid had enough. "Shepherd," she called, "come and help me. Please hurry." To the horror of her enemies, there was the shepherd, leaping toward them. Immediately, they ran in different directions, trying to escape. Here he comes, telling them to go away. "Oh, shepherd, thank you. I didn't call you sooner because I thought I could get rid of them myself. Why couldn't I do it?" "I think," said the shepherd gently, "that lately you were beginning to tell yourself that it was time I led you back toward the mountains of the high places. Perhaps you have been impatient instead of acceptance with joy. Perhaps you liked what they had to say." Much Afraid felt her cheeks getting hot. The shepherd was right. She put her hand into his. "I have been thinking that you have led me on this path too long and that you have forgotten your promises. I'm sorry. You are my shepherd. I will trust you and follow you where you lead." The shepherd stooped down and picked up a stone which was lying beside her feet. He smiled and said, "Put this in your bag with the other stones. It will help you remember your promise to wait patiently until I do what I have said I would do." There's the shepherd again. Much Afraid and her helpers walked for many, many days along the shores of Lake Loneliness. Pride, resentment, bitterness, and self-pity kept attacking her, but Much Afraid was getting stronger. She kept remembering to accept the path with joy, no matter what, and to trust the shepherd. Finally, they arrived at a different place. It was a lovely country filled with fruit trees and hills. Everywhere she looked, there were singing birds and blossoming flowers. She felt as though she had stepped out of winter and into spring. Isn't that a good feeling when winter's over and spring comes and the flowers start just like they are here in New Hampshire. In a short while, they came to the edge of some trees, and Much Afraid gave a little cry of joy. There was the shepherd, waiting to meet them. She ran toward him as though she had wings on her feet. "Welcome, welcome, 1,000 times welcome," she cried, throwing herself into his big, strong arms. "I have come to bring you a message," said the shepherd as he held her. "It is time for you to see what I will do." "Oh, shepherd," she cried as she pulled away from him a bit and looked into his eyes. "Do you mean that I am finally going to the high places?" She thought he nodded, but he didn't answer her. He just stood looking at her with a soft sort of smile. "Do you mean it?" she asked. "Do you mean that soon you will be taking me to the high places?" This time he answered yes, and added with a strange smile, "Now you will see what I will do." He held her for another moment before leaving them, and Much Afraid felt as though strength was pouring into her. Much Afraid had a song in her heart as she walked among the fields and trees of that country. Can you guys hear #snoring? She doesn't think this book is very interesting. I hope you're not snoring. She continued on her happy journey for some time. One day, they reached the top of one of the hills just as the sun was rising. There, not far away, were the mountains. Much Afraid thought she had never seen anything so beautiful. Finally, after such a long time, the path that Much Afraid and her 2 helpers traveled had turned toward the high places. Much Afraid fell on her knees and worshipped. It seemed to her at that moment that all of the pain and all the troubles had been worthwhile. It seemed to her also that even sorrow and suffering were smiling with her. Then Much Afraid realized something else. She was beginning to understand the language spoken by these 2 sisters. She remembered what the shepherd had told her when she first met sorrow and suffering. As you travel with them, little by little, you will learn to understand their words. As she rose to her feet, Much Afraid took their hands in hers, and the 3 travelers started their journey once again. Here's a picture of the shepherd who he greeted her in the fields. All right, so that is the end of chapter 3. So I'm going to ask you 3 questions that you can be thinking about before we meet for chapter 4, okay? When is it hard for you to trust God? What are some things that make you feel impatient? And do you ever feel angry at God? Those are some things to think about, and we'll talk about them when we come back for chapter 4, all right? Okay, hashtag, can you say goodbye? Or just go back to snoring? We love you.